The desert of East Africa does not announce itself with violence. It erases life quietly. At first glance, the land appears still an endless stretch of pale soil, fractured by heat, scattered with thorny shrubs that cast shadows too thin to offer shelter. The sun hangs high in unforgiving, bleaching color from everything beneath it. There is no refuge here. No tree line to retreat into. No river to soften the ground. Only open exposure where the air itself seems to press down. By midday, the surface temperature rises beyond what skin can endure. Moisture vanishes almost as soon as it forms. Even insects limit their movement, retreating into cracks in the earth. For larger animals, the danger is not dramatic, it is constant. Prolonged exposure means dehydration, heat exhaustion, collapse, death without a struggle. Predators understand this place well. Lions move only at the edges of the day. Leopards remain hidden, conserving energy. Many abandon these regions entirely, drifting toward landscapes where the odds are less punishing. Here, speed alone is not enough. Strength offers no guarantee. The desert does not negotiate. What survives does so by knowing when not to move. The ground itself becomes the final barrier between life and extinction. Below the surface, temperatures drop sharply. Darkness replaces glare. Stillness replaces exposure. Underground, the desert loosens its grip, but entry is limited. Not every creature can carve its way beneath the earth. Not every species is granted access to that narrow margin where survival remains possible. Across these arid plains, survival is not defined by dominance, but by timing and tolerance. Animals emerge briefly, feed quickly, then vanish again, racing against heat that never rests. Mistakes are punished immediately. Hesitation costs energy. Energy once lost cannot be recovered here. There are no second chances in this environment, only short windows where existence is permitted. In such places, the absence of life is more telling than its presence. Empty horizons speak of countless failures. Species that once passed through but could not remain. Bodies claimed by heat long before any predator arrived. Yet among these silences, subtle movement persists. Tracks appear at dawn, then fade by noon. Signs of grazing emerge where nothing should endure. Evidence that something somewhere has learned how to exist, where survival seems mathematically impossible. Not through power, not through speed, but through a strategy the desert itself did not intend to allow. And in this land where even predators retreat, life continues quietly, briefly, and always on borrowed time. Across landscapes where survival favors speed, strength or concealment, the desert warthog appears fundamentally misplaced. Its body offers little protection from heat. Sparse hair leaves thick skin exposed to the sun. Its legs are short-built, more for endurance than escape. There is no camouflage to break its outline against the pale ground, no sudden burst of speed to outrun danger. Even its tusks, often mistaken for weapons, serve more as tools for foraging than defense. In most ecosystems, such limitations would be unforgiving. In the semi-desert regions of East Africa, they should be fatal. The desert warthog occupies one of the lowest and most vulnerable positions in the food web. It feeds primarily on grasses, roots, and low vegetation resources that disappear quickly under prolonged drought. Unlike browsers that can reach higher foliage, it remains bound to what little the ground provides. During dry seasons, that margin narrows to almost nothing. Predators do not need to hunt the warthog aggressively. Opportunity alone is often enough. Yet despite these disadvantages, desert warthogs persist in places where even some carnivores withdraw. Their presence is sporadic, easy to overlook, and rarely concentrated. They do not dominate territory. They do not reshape the land. Instead, they exist within narrow tolerances, shaped by constraints rather than power. Their daily activity reflects this reality. Movement is deliberate and brief. Feeding occurs during cooler windows, often early in the morning or late in the afternoon. Prolonged exposure is avoided at all costs. Every step taken in open sunlight increases risk not only from predators, but from the environment itself. What distinguishes the desert warthog is not what it can do, but what it avoids. Unlike many desert-adapted mammals, it does not possess specialized physiological cooling mechanisms. It does not store large reserves of fat or water. It cannot regulate heat through long-distance migration. Instead, its survival depends on something far less visible and far more fragile: shelter. In these regions, shelter is not a convenience. It is a boundary between life and immediate death. Shade alone is insufficient. Surface temperatures remain lethal even beneath thin cover. The only reliable protection lies underground, where temperatures stabilize and moisture lingers longer than above. But the desert warthog does not create this refuge. It lacks the physical adaptations required for deep excavation. Its forelimbs are not built for sustained digging. Its body is poorly suited to long periods beneath the surface. The warthog survives not by shaping its environment, but by inheriting what already exists. Across the plains, abandoned burrows once carved by other species become lifelines. These subterranean spaces offer escape from heat concealment from predators and protection for the most vulnerable stages of life. Without them, the desert warthog cannot remain in these regions for long. This dependence defines the species' role in the ecosystem. It does not stand alone. Its survival is quietly tethered to the presence of other animals, whose absence would leave the desert warthog exposed, stranded on the surface, with no margin left. In environments where independence is often mistaken for strength, the desert warthog persists through reliance. It survives not by overcoming the desert, but by slipping into the narrow spaces where the desert loosens its grip, spaces it did not create and cannot afford to lose. In the desert, danger does not always announce itself with movement. For the desert warthog, the first and most persistent threat is neither claws nor teeth, but time spent above ground. Every minute exposed to open sunlight pushes the body closer to its limits. Heat builds steadily without urgency, without drama. There is no sudden signal to retreat, only a gradual narrowing of tolerance. Water is scarce, and when it appears it does so briefly. Seasonal pools evaporate within hours. Vegetation dries before it can recover. The warthog's feeding grounds offer little shade, forcing it to remain visible while it searches for roots and grasses pressed flat against the soil. Unlike animals that can graze quickly and retreat, the warthog's posture keeps it low, stationary, and exposed. Movement becomes a calculation. To feed is necessary. To remain feeding is dangerous. As temperatures rise, the ground itself becomes hostile. Hooves strike soil hot enough to burn. Breath accelerates. Muscles fatigue faster than they should. The desert warthog cannot sweat efficiently, nor can it shed heat through specialized anatomy. Its body absorbs warmth faster than it can release it. The margin between function and collapse is narrow. Predators exploit this vulnerability, but they are not the primary pressure. Lions and leopards understand the cost of movement here. They too avoid prolonged exposure. Many hunts are abandoned not because prey escapes, but because heat drains strength before contact is made. In these regions, predator and prey are bound by the same constraint. The difference lies in recovery. Predators can withdraw into cover rest and return later. The desert warthog does not have that luxury unless it can reach shelter below the surface. Without it, exhaustion compounds rapidly. Heat stress leads to disorientation. Reaction times slow. Awareness fades. In such conditions, even minor threats become lethal. This is where the desert begins to close in. The warthog cannot outrun danger once its energy drops. It cannot fight effectively. Its survival depends on anticipating collapse before it occurs. Retreat must happen early, long before visible distress sets in. Waiting too long leaves no room for correction. Across the open plains, this creates a constant tension between need and exposure. Feeding grounds are rarely close to safety. Each foraging excursion extends the distance between the warthog and protection. The farther it travels, the greater the risk that return becomes impossible. In most ecosystems, animals solve this problem by creating shelter. Burrowing species carve refuge beneath their feet. Others adapt to nocturnal movement or migrate seasonally. The desert warthog does none of these things completely. It does not dig. It does not migrate far. It cannot rely solely on night. Instead, it operates within a fragile network of borrowed protection. Abandoned burrows scattered across the landscape become critical nodes. Some lie close enough to feeding areas to offer temporary escape. Others are too distant, forcing the warthog to gamble on endurance. Each day, survival depends on memory, knowing which shelters still exist, which have collapsed, and which may now be occupied by something more dangerous. Not all burrows remain usable. Sand shifts. Entrances cave in. Competing species claim the space. What was once a lifeline can disappear between seasons, sometimes between days. The warthog has no way to replace it. When shelter fails, the consequences are immediate. Without access to the cooler air beneath the surface, body temperature rises rapidly. Shade alone offers no relief. Even beneath sparse vegetation, heat reflects upward from the ground, trapping warmth rather than dispersing it. Within minutes, the risk of collapse increases sharply. There is no visible struggle when this happens. No chase, no confrontation. The animal slows, then stops. Predators may arrive later, but the outcome has already been decided by the environment. This silent pressure defines the warthog's daily existence. Survival is not measured in victories, but in successful returns moments, when the animal reaches safety before its limits are exceeded. Each retreat underground resets the balance, allowing heat to dissipate, breathing to slow, and energy to stabilize. But every return also reinforces dependence. The desert warthog's life is shaped not by what it controls, but by what remains available. Its survival is tied to the continued presence of structures it did not build and cannot repair. As long as those spaces exist, the species endures. When they vanish, exposure becomes unavoidable. In the desert, failure does not need force. It only needs time, heat, and the absence of shelter. When the desert warthog retreats, it does not flee toward safety it created. It runs toward absence, toward openings in the ground that may or may not still exist. Across the arid plains, moments of exposure accumulate until retreat becomes unavoidable. Muscles tighten, breathing shortens. Heat presses inward with increasing force. At that point, survival depends on a single condition: reaching the entrance to a burrow before the body begins to fail. The descent is immediate. There is no hesitation at the threshold. The warthog drops low, reversing into darkness, tusks forward, legs scrambling for purchase. The temperature shift is abrupt. Above ground, the air burns. Below it cools sharply, stripping heat from skin and lungs alike. This transition is the difference between recovery and collapse. Inside the burrow, light disappears. The desert's glare cannot penetrate the soil. Air circulation slows. Moisture lingers longer here than anywhere on the surface. In these confined spaces, body temperature stabilizes, heart rate decreases, and energy loss slows enough for survival to continue. But the shelter itself is not guaranteed. The desert warthog does not excavate these refuges. Its limbs lack the strength and structure needed for sustained digging. Its body is not designed for reshaping hardened ground. Every burrow it uses is inherited, left behind by species that once occupied the space and moved on or disappeared entirely. Most of these burrows were carved by animals, adapted for excavation: aardvarks, porcupines, and other subterranean specialists. Their tunnels cut deep enough to escape lethal heat, creating microclimates that persist long after their original builders abandon them. For the warthog, these spaces are not optional. They are essential infrastructure. Without access to them, surface survival time drops to minutes. Shade alone cannot compensate. Thin vegetation offers no insulation from reflected heat. Even brief delays in reaching underground refuge can result in overheating that cannot be reversed. The urgency of retreat defines daily movement. Feeding paths are shaped not by abundance of food, but by proximity to shelter. Routes are chosen based on memory locations where burrows once existed. Entrances that have remained open tunnels that have not collapsed or flooded. Yet memory offers no certainty. Burrows degrade quickly in desert environments. Wind-driven sand fills entrances. Heavy rains can cause ceilings to cave in. Competing animals may claim the space, turning refuge into risk. What was once safe becomes inaccessible without warning. When a warthog arrives to find an entrance, blocked options vanish almost instantly. There is no time to search widely. Energy reserves are already depleted. Heat accumulation is already advanced. The animal must either locate an alternative shelter nearby or attempt to endure above ground longer than its physiology allows. Many do not succeed. This reliance on borrowed shelter introduces a constant vulnerability. Survival hinges on conditions beyond the warthog's control, on the continued presence of species that create these burrows, on environmental stability that prevents collapse, and on timing precise enough to avoid competition for space. Inside the burrow, even safety is temporary. The warthog cannot remain underground indefinitely. Oxygen levels decline. Space is limited. Extended occupancy increases the risk of confrontation with other animals seeking the same refuge. Snakes, jackals, and small predators may enter these tunnels drawn by shade and concealment. What protects against heat may expose the warthog to new threats. Still, the balance favors retreat. Short periods underground allow recovery. Heat dissipates. Muscles relax. When conditions above briefly improve, early morning, late afternoon moments. When cloud cover reduces exposure, the warthog emerges again. Each emergence is a calculated risk. The desert does not offer safety. It only offers intervals where survival is temporarily permitted. Between those intervals, the warthog moves, feeds, and retreats in a repeating cycle dictated by temperature rather than opportunity. This pattern reveals the true nature of its adaptation. The desert warthog does not conquer its environment. It survives by aligning itself with the few weaknesses the desert allows. It slips into the margins created by other species, by geological accidents, by tunnels dug for entirely different purposes. Its existence depends on continuity. As long as burrows remain scattered across the landscape, the warthog can navigate between them. As long as those underground refuges persist, recovery remains possible. But this network is fragile. It cannot expand on its own. It can only shrink. Every collapsed entrance reduces the number of safe routes. Every vanished burrow increases the distance between exposure and recovery. Over time, the landscape becomes less forgiving, even if food remains available. The desert does not need to hunt the warthog. It only needs to remove the spaces that allow it to pause. In this environment, survival is not secured through dominance or strength, but through access. Access to darkness, access to cooler air, access to structures built by others and inherited without ownership. The warthog lives within a system it cannot repair. It depends on remnants of activity that may no longer be ongoing. And as long as those remnants endure, so does the species, quietly, briefly, always retreating just in time. But when they disappear, there is no adaptation left to reveal, only exposure. For the desert warthog, survival is not measured only by endurance of heat or escape from danger. It is measured by whether life can continue beyond a single season. Reproduction in arid landscapes demands conditions that rarely align. Food must be available long enough to support pregnancy. Temperatures must allow newborns to survive exposure, and shelter must exist not temporarily, but consistently through the most vulnerable stages of life. For desert warthogs, this requirement returns again to the same narrow point beneath the surface. Birth does not take place in open ground. The desert offers no margin for error. Newborn warthogs lack the capacity to regulate body temperature effectively. Their skin is thin, their movements uncoordinated, their endurance minimal. Even brief exposure to direct sunlight can be fatal. The burrow becomes the center of life. Within these underground spaces, the environment changes. Temperatures remain stable. Air holds faint traces of moisture. Darkness shields fragile bodies from the extremes above. Here, piglets spend the earliest and most dangerous weeks of existence. But this protection is conditional. The burrow was not designed for them. Its size, depth, and structure vary depending on the species that originally excavated it. Some tunnels are shallow, offering limited insulation. Others extend deeper, providing greater protection, but restricting movement. The warthog adapts to whatever space is available, adjusting behavior rather than environment. Inside activity is minimal. Movement is limited to conserve energy. Emerging too early exposes piglets to heat they cannot tolerate. Remaining too long increases other risks: oxygen depletion, parasite buildup, and intrusion by other animals seeking shelter. Every decision is constrained by the same dependency. As piglets grow, they must eventually surface. This transition marks a critical phase. Above ground, the desert offers little forgiveness. Young warthogs are slow, poorly coordinated, and unable to travel far without rest. Their survival depends on proximity, how close the feeding grounds lie to the burrow, and how quickly retreat remains possible. At this stage, even small disruptions become fatal. A collapsed entrance removes shelter entirely. A predator occupying the tunnel blocks access. Shifting sand may narrow passageways beyond what juveniles can navigate. When this happens, there is no alternative refuge to seek. The warthog family cannot construct a replacement. They must abandon the site or remain exposed. Abandonment carries its own cost. Moving young across open terrain increases exposure time. Heat stress accumulates quickly. Predators detect slow movement more easily. Each relocation attempts to solve one problem by creating several others. Many do not succeed. The desert does not announce these losses. There are no visible carcasses scattered across the plains. Mortality occurs quietly, often underground, or during brief surface exposure that leaves little trace. Over time, entire local populations can decline without drawing attention. Food may still exist. Predators may remain present. But the invisible infrastructure that made survival possible has eroded. This fragility defines the species. Unlike animals that can adapt behaviorally or physically to changing conditions, desert warthogs are bound to stability they do not control. Their reproductive success depends on the continued presence of burrow-building species. When those species decline due to climate shifts, habitat disruption, or resource loss, the impact ripples outward. First, fewer burrows are created. Then existing ones degrade. Finally, shelter becomes too sparse to support reproduction. Adults may persist for a time, surviving day to day, by locating the remaining refuges. But without consistent shelter, young do not survive at the same rate. Over generations, numbers fall not dramatically, but steadily. This pattern repeats across arid regions. Desert warthogs do not disappear through confrontation. They fade through imbalance. Their decline reflects changes occurring beneath the surface, long before signs appear above it. Yet as long as the system holds, however precariously the species endures, piglets emerge cautiously, learning routes between shelter and feeding grounds. Movements remain short, deliberate, and tied to recovery points below the soil. Life continues within a narrow corridor of tolerance. This dependence shapes behavior across generations. Warthogs do not expand aggressively into new areas. They remain anchored to landscapes where burrows already exist. Their range reflects not opportunity, but limitation. In ecosystems often defined by competition and dominance, the desert warthog survives through alignment. It occupies spaces made available by others. It persists by fitting into gaps left behind, rather than carving its own. This strategy carries a cost. When the balance shifts, there is no reserve to draw from. No hidden adaptation waiting to emerge. Only the same dependency exposed. And as the desert continues to change slowly, silently, the survival of the desert warthog remains tied to forces it neither controls nor confronts. It exists because the underground still allows it to. The greatest threat to the desert warthog does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly beneath the surface, long before its effects become visible above ground. Across arid and semi-desert regions, the animals that once shaped the underground landscape begin to decline. Burrow builders species capable of breaking compacted soil and carving deep tunnels are among the first to be affected by prolonged drought habitat fragmentation and subtle environmental shifts. Their disappearance is rarely dramatic. Numbers drop gradually. Activity decreases. New burrows become less frequent. At first, the change seems insignificant. Existing tunnels remain. Entrances still dot the landscape. For a time, the desert warthog continues its routines uninterrupted, moving between familiar refuges, feeding within known limits, retreating underground before heat overwhelms the body. The system appears intact, but the infrastructure is no longer renewing itself. Burrows collapse more quickly than they are replaced. Wind-driven sand fills passages. Seasonal rains weaken ceilings that once held firm. Without active maintenance or new excavation, the underground network begins to shrink. Each lost burrow narrows the margin of survival. Distances between refuges increase. Feeding routes grow longer. Exposure times extend. Recovery windows shorten. What was once a manageable balance becomes a series of escalating risks. The warthog does not recognize this shift immediately. Its behavior remains unchanged. It follows patterns shaped by generations of reliance on shelter that no longer exists at the same density. Memory leads it to entrances that have vanished. Retreat routes terminate abruptly in collapsed soil. Each failed return forces a decision under pressure search: further endure longer or abandon the area entirely. None of these options favor survival. Searching consumes energy already depleted by heat. Enduring longer accelerates physiological failure. Abandoning territory exposes individuals to unfamiliar ground, where shelter may be even scarcer. The landscape offers no compensatory benefit. Predators play a secondary role in this process. They do not drive the decline directly. Instead, they exploit the consequences. Animals forced to remain above ground longer move more slowly. Reaction times degrade. Awareness dulls. Encounters that might once have been avoided become unavoidable. Yet even when predators are absent, losses continue. Heat alone is sufficient. As burrows vanish, mortality increases without spectacle. Individuals succumb to exhaustion during routine foraging. Others collapse before reaching distant shelter. Juveniles fail to survive their first exposures above ground. Reproduction slows, then falters. Population decline begins not with conflict, but with interruption. The interruption of shelter availability. This process is difficult to detect from the surface. Vegetation patterns may appear unchanged. Predator numbers may remain stable. To an outside observer, the ecosystem seems intact, but below ground, its foundations are eroding. The desert warthog becomes a silent indicator of this imbalance. Its survival depends on the presence of species that alter the environment in ways it cannot. When those species disappear, the warthog follows not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Its fate is sealed by dependency, not by weakness. In some regions, this chain reaction accelerates. As climate variability increases, rainfall becomes unpredictable. Burrow builders struggle to maintain activity during prolonged dry periods. Their reproduction declines. With fewer new tunnels created, existing refuges become overcrowded or contested. Competition intensifies, further reducing access for species that rely on abandoned burrows. The desert warthog is rarely the priority occupant. More aggressive or better adapted animals claim remaining shelters. Snakes, jackals, and other opportunistic species occupy tunnels once used safely. What was once refuge becomes hazard. Retreat underground no longer guarantees protection. This shift forces behavioral changes that offer no long-term solution. Warthogs adjust activity windows, emerging earlier or later in the day to avoid peak heat. They reduce movement distances. They linger closer to remaining shelters, even when food availability declines. These adjustments delay collapse, but do not prevent it. The system is contracting. As the underground network fragments, the warthog's range shrinks with it. Populations become isolated, clustered around the last remaining refuges. Genetic exchange decreases. Local extinctions occur quietly, leaving gaps that are not recolonized. There is no adaptive breakthrough. The desert warthog does not evolve new digging capabilities within a generation. It does not develop enhanced heat tolerance rapidly enough to offset shelter loss. Its strategy, successful only under specific conditions, fails when those conditions disappear. This is the paradox of its survival. What allowed the species to persist in one of the harshest environments on Earth also limits its ability to respond when that environment changes. Reliance becomes rigidity. Flexibility narrows to a single axis that, once broken, cannot be repaired. From a distance, the desert remains unchanged. The sun still rises, the heat still builds. Predators still roam the plains. But one presence fades, not through violence, not through conquest, but through the gradual removal of space. The disappearance of burrow builders does not announce itself as a crisis. It reveals itself through absence, through the failure of one species to appear where it once did, through empty feeding grounds, through tracks that no longer return to shelter. In ecosystems shaped by visible struggle, this kind of loss is easy to overlook, yet it is decisive. The desert warthog's survival has always depended on margins. As those margins vanish, so does the species' ability to exist in places where it once endured. When the underground collapses, the surface becomes uninhabitable, and in a landscape where exposure alone is lethal, the loss of shelter is final. As daylight fades across the desert, the land appears unchanged. The same heat-softened soil stretches toward the horizon. The same winds pass over grass too sparse to slow them. From above, nothing suggests loss. Nothing signals collapse. The desert gives no indication of what it has already taken. Yet absence tells its own story. Where burrows once dotted the plains entrances are sealed by sand. Routes that once allowed brief movement between shelter now end in open ground. Feeding areas remain, but the paths back no longer exist. The desert warthog does not vanish in conflict. It recedes quietly, retreating from places that can no longer support the pause its survival requires. This disappearance leaves little evidence, no dramatic decline, no sudden shift in predator behavior, only silence where activity once occurred. The desert warthog was never a dominant presence. It did not shape the land through force or abundance. Its existence relied on continuity, on the persistence of underground spaces created by others, on a balance maintained below the surface. As long as that balance held, survival remained possible. When it failed, there was no adaptation left to reveal. In the natural world, resilience is often mistaken for strength. But endurance can also arise from dependence, from fitting precisely into the narrow margins an environment allows. The desert warthog survived not by resisting the desert, but by aligning itself with the few weaknesses the desert permitted. It lived on borrowed ground. Borrowed shade, borrowed shelter, borrowed time. Such strategies are invisible until they are gone. By the time loss becomes apparent, recovery is no longer possible. The system has already shifted beyond what the species can tolerate. Across the arid landscapes of East Africa, the desert continues its work unchanged and indifferent. Life persists where it can, retreats where it must, and disappears where tolerance is exceeded. The desert warthog's story is not one of failure. It is a record of how survival can exist without power, how persistence can depend entirely on what remains unseen. Beneath the surface, where heat loosens its grip, life once found space to endure. When those spaces closed, the surface reclaimed everything above it. In environments that offer no forgiveness, survival is never guaranteed. It is only borrowed and always temporary.